Y aprovecho esta última parte de mi moderación también para un anuncio comercial. Está a la venta los últimos 2 ejemplares de mi libro sobre el impacto cultural de Las Vegas en la Ciudad de México. Se pueden comunicar con Pablo. Muy bien, entonces iniciamos esta última parte del coloquio con una ponencia de Peter Schneemann. Es un gran gusto tenerlo aquí otra vez. Ya estuvo varias veces con nosotros aquí en México y coordina un proyecto sobre ecología y estética. Entonces, en ese sentido también estamos colaborando cercanamente. Y hoy nos va a presentar su visión neo-humboldtiana o lo que sea sobre un caso interesante del arte contemporáneo. Adelante, Peter.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much to the organizers. And I really appreciate that you still have some energy to listen to my little sketch based on the idea Peter articulated that we focus on one piece. So it's really take it as a kind of, like a little sketch. In February 2019, the German president, so the representative of Germany, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, accompanied by his partner, visited Ecuador. It was part of their tour through Latin America. They paid tribute to Alexander von Humboldt and visited places that are linked to his explorations in Colombia, Ecuador, etc. They visited also the region of the volcano Antizana. Today, it was already mentioned, the entire area belongs to a protected ecological reserve. Several scientists working on Humboldt, Ottmar Ette, Andrea Wolf, we heard already about it, and others accompanied him. In nearby Quito, gave Steinmeier a programmatic lecture at the university to open the so-called Humboldt Year there. I quote, seine Reisen in Lateinamerika gemeinsam mit seinen französischen Kollegen haben ihn erkennen lassen, was schließlich uns gelehrt hat, dass der Mensch eine Bedeutung in der Natur hat und eine Verantwortung für die Natur, etc. So Humboldt as the figure we could learn from in terms of our position towards nature, the responsibility necessary in terms of coexistence. The press documented the visit with reference to Humboldt's suffering, with reference to the better shoes Steinmeier has, and with pictures that claim to document the very same spot where Humboldt stood around the 15th and 16th March 1802, a place he described in detail in his diary, developing a vivid image of the painful nights he lived through. It would be the task of Peter KRIEGER to apply the tools of political iconography and to analyze the gesture of the president and the visual strategy of the extensive press campaign linked to this visit. I would like to focus on one point of reference only. An important detail of the picture might be identified as a house, a cabin in the background. It serves as an indication of human activity at the site. It is a kind of cultural index contrasting in its humble dimension the sublime appearance of the iconic volcano at the Andes Mountains. The Ecuadorian standing over 18,700 feet high on the dark green lawn in front of the white artisana. There is a stone shed with a thatched roof so low that one can only enter when bent over. It is claimed that this historic cottage was the base camp, the Basislager by Humboldt at 4,000 meters above sea level, offering protection from inhospitable nature. The house was object of a careful documentation by specialists from Bamberg using structure from motion technology, thus producing a digital model that would reconstruct the building at the moment Humboldt was using it. A house is an anthropologically fundamental structure that gives form to the relation between the human and this environment. It contrasts in a way the moment of travel and dislocation. It serves as a shelter, as an infrastructure in order to explore the environment. The Humboldt specialists might know much better than I do how extensive Humboldt's diaries describe the infrastructures and logistics for his observations, noted down in a diary in French, but also in several articles, sometimes leading to a kind of architecture. I take this shelter as a starting point for the description of a contemporary artwork that also touches upon questions of infrastructure and observation, questions of how we do perceive the environment with our body, with our eyes, by our movements. What are the conditions for an experience of the environment today? This might sound like a weak poetic phrase, rather general and empty, but when we take it seriously, then it does maybe relate to the task to develop a consciousness and responsibility that Steinmeier, ghostwriter, find in the reading of Humboldt. What I show you is a truly contemporary work, having been installed in spring 2019, the very same month when Steinmeier visited the base camp. It is a temporary installation. This means it will be dismantled after 2 years. I quote from the press text, reflecting and interacting with the mountain landscape over the changing seasons. The reference between the two houses is, of course, to be very clear, my own claim, a relation that only serves to explain my interest in the contemporary installation I visited this summer. It is a site-specific installation by the American cross-media artist Doug Aitken in the Swiss mountains, extremely popular and accessible by a wide range of people that visit the Berner Oberland. So school classes, hiking groups, farmers, and the international art jet set. My short intervention has 3 sections. First, the house as an infrastructure. Secondly, the framing and mediation of observation between image and situation. And finally, displacements and fictions. Doug Aitken's constructed a house in the Berner Oberland in the area of Bierstadt. The place offers an impressive panorama of the Alps. It is placed on a hill outside of a village and accessible only on foot, crossing a plateau of green meadows in summer, in snowy hills in winter. If you were looking for an ideal site for your holiday home, it would be exactly there. The structure is a house on an abstract, clear, clean level. The house as primary structure. There are no glasses in the windows, no fireplace, no doors. Nevertheless, or even maybe because of that, it is immediately understood as house, like a playground or a backdrop for a film. The hikers enter it, explore it, they want to get rid of their backpacks, sit on the doorsteps and look into the landscape. The house itself is a bit too big. As such, it seems misplaced. It's a generic house in this upscale resort village where the very rich construct their holidays houses, always a bit too big, a kind of fake style, perceived as brutal and tasteless due to building regulations, never really modern, most of the time empty. There is an entire initiative called the Cold Bed Initiative to stop these buildings that are 90% of the year empty, and one night in this wonderful chalet is $10,000. On some of the, you find the exact geographical indication where the house is built, and some of the walls appears in thin lines, the topographical lines of the site. Bierstadt is the prototype of the cultural landscape, the Kulturlandschaft in the Alps, a careful, controlled park. Nothing is wild. The farmers earn money because they work as landscape gardeners and park ranger. The cows are more important for the tourists than for the production of milk. The wonderful, efficient train line has its track just beneath the art project. You see it, like in a children's book. A most aggressive and invasive hidden technical infrastructure uses each winter millions of gallons of water for artificial snow. Most of the income comes from a tourist industry that operates with stereotypes of the sublime Alps and traditional modes of living. The mountain aesthetics as a label for economy. Doug Aitken's installation marks the blurring of different typologies of the architecture in the Alps. So beside the reference to the pseudo-chalets of Hollywood stars and the chalet tradition, there might be even a link to the highly interesting cultural history, to the expedition and the exploration of the mountains. The house as an ecological interface, remoteness, sight, shelter, appropriation of landscape. Everything is inscribed in this question of the house in the landscape. And of course, we could go back to the emblems in the 17th century, the question of gaining wisdom in exploring the mountains, published in 1618. I don't want to go into this. With much less explicit metaphorical implication, the history of alpinism is a history of shelters. I show you an example of the early 19th century that was important for the research on the glaciers in 1827. Franz Josef Huggy from Solothurn built a primitive hut on the glacier when pounded in a series of stakes and chiseled marks onto the rocks, becoming the first to measure glacial movement. You see here the little modest shed that was then documented by Agassiz and represented as a key moment in the exploration of the mountains. One might also hint at the fact that the old, you see here the important publication from 1813, which is kind of one example of these literature of the exploration of the Alps and commenting on the necessity of shelter. But one might also hint at the fact that the old association of the Swiss alpinists, the SRC, pushed the old shelters into a new age. I just show you maybe the most prominent example. The new Monte Rosa Lodge became 2009 the model for the combination of nature and high-tech equipment for developing systems of sustainability, an international acclaimed project of self-sufficient building in the high Alps. This was developed in collaboration with the ETH, with a research project that was aiming at developing new algorithms and software and hardware solutions for the optimal management of energy and waste flows in buildings in the Alps. The key idea is to optimize the interactions of different available energy sources, storage systems, and consumers. However, I want to end this chapter on the reference fields of Aitken's house as infrastructure with here one is one of the most beautiful images there. You see the Monte Rosa cut. But let me finish with a different example, an intervention in the Berner Oberland by George Steinmann, who will finish this colloquium. In the poorest community in the county of Bern, he constructed a bridge and a cabin as an intervention that had its reference point in the tax administration in Bern, in the city of Bern. Instead of decorating the public building in the city, he set up these cultural index points in the remote village of Saxeten. Its great success story has an impact on the village, attracting visitors. But the most importantly, it leads over to another aspect I want to discuss, and this is the aspect of observation and experience. This perspective wonders of how the stage set frames our self-awareness as acting identities in the Alpine landscape. How the stage sets frames, it's a strange English. Anyway, you understand what I mean. Steinmann's work leads to consideration to think of such basic structures, bridge and cabin, as a membrane that allows that inside and outside are in flux. The inner world of imagination and the outer world of the landscape. While Aitken works with panorama, Steinmann works with contemplation. And this leads me to the second note on this work by Aitken. In collaborating with Peter KRIEGER, we had long discussions about the questions of the status and the function of the media that are used to inform us about the environment, about crisis and ethical demands. How do we acquire certainty about the necessity to act? One question that actually was put forward in the very first paper of this conference. In how far do experiences are stronger than information? I did and still do question the status of the image as mediator and focus on artistic strategies that go beyond the image. The construction of Aitken's show an interesting merge, I think, of our positions. Although a physical construction, it does vanish in its surrounding. The heavy construction negates itself, only appears, like the title suggests, as mirage, or otherwise phrased, it turns the landscape into a flat image, a pure radical surface. The house itself becomes a medium of framing and representing, composing, fragmenting, multiplying the image, multiplying nature in order to gain sublimity, a kind of periscope-like experience we can discuss as well. Already the presentation and marketing of the artwork operated with renderings, and its attractivity today is translated into a well-calculated readiness for Instagrammers. It does not only multiply the panorama, but it serves as a multiplicator for the image in the media. The visitors, in fact, come because of the renderings distributed by the studio of Aitken's, and much stronger because they want to reenact the very same images they saw on the internet. The mountain environment as experience in a loop of picture production. Narcissism as a kind of documenting climate change, you could say. So, for example, this person is actually photographing into this kind of mirrored space. When I do show you some pictures that might demonstrate that you get confused about the questions, which part does show indeed the landscape in a kind of direct way, which one shows, and which one shows the reflected landscape. The clearness of the mirror, the artificiality of the glass material gives the situation a special twist in this concentration of the surface. There you see it as well. So inside and outside it is mirrored. We remember, especially since the 1960s, the mirror has become the device that artists like Dan Graham used to construct devices that lead to a self-consciousness of the viewer, inscribing himself into the space, observing himself in taking part in a situation. Dan Graham was interested in the mirror as a phenomenon of modern office buildings in the cities, choreographing the flow of people. This contemporaneity is also very much present in Aitken's aesthetic. I just show you some examples you all probably know. Did I describe the appearance of the house as artificial? Well, although the ecological discourse is used in the paratext of Mirage, I found finally, the special electronic devices spread around the building to get rid of any birds that could spoil the spotless surface. There it is. So it's a sound system that are normally used in other contexts to get rid of the bird shit. The house by Aitken works and functions as a social space where observers look at themselves, how they observe the reflected and framed landscape, and realize how the other visitors start performing, taking on roles, some trying to take an image of the mirror without themselves, others performing for the mirror mediations in order to be looked at. Maybe it is just justified to describe the shed as podium, as stage for positioning oneself towards nature in a very special way as panorama. It is interesting to see that the architecture of cultural institutions at the very moment have realized that the windows, the semi-reflected gaze into the world, belongs at the moment to the most attractive elements of the museum. The art space opened its walls in order to turn the world into an image. You can go to the New Whitney in New York. You can observe this. This is the example at the Centre Pompidou, Metz. The idea of multiplying the sensual effect of the environment or demonstrating mass culture devices as interface leaves the critical stance open. Similar maybe to Olafur Eliasson, the line between simulacrum, kitsch, and analytical commentary is not clearly defined. However, the stress on the infrastructures, the framing devices of observing nature, turning into an image, into a sensation, has to be regarded, I think, as an important contribution to the current environmental discourse. Aitken does not limit himself to the visual. I refer here just to the sonic. Oh, yeah, this is for me it's a piece that not yet realized, but there you find the kind of blurring between the Alpine mountain panorama and kind of new age aesthetics. You could think of a club or something, and this is the anechoic chamber. Just to make clear this point between Eliasson and thing. But here I wanted to show you that these questions of the sensation is crucial for his work, and I refer to the Sonic Pavilion in the park of Inutim in Brazil from 2009. Its construction involved the boring of a 200-meter deep well in the ground in order to install a set of microphones to capture the sound of the earth. By way of a sophisticated system of equalization and amplification, this sound is played in real time inside the empty circular pavilion, which was designed to create equivalence between the audio experience and one's relations to the surrounding space. New Age spiritual quality is in there clearly. If you think of James Turrell, etc., we could develop on this. Art that claims to intensify the sensual experience of the self and the world. So let me finish. So there you have the inside where people lay down or make kind of yoga movements and feel connected, right? But I want to make a last point. The mediation of the environment overrides the old concept of the site-specific. Although in the Swiss discourse not very present, Aitken's house incorporates geographical transfers and the narration of the absent, the distant, the detached. In 2017, the very same mirrored house was installed at the Californian desert as well as in a former bank building. So this is the bank building, and here you have the more important first installation, Mirage, in California in the desert. It is the Mirage as a phenomenon not only a result of steep thermal inversion, but of the imagination of the absent in a moment of crisis? And it's interesting to see that for Humboldt, in his book from 1850, the Mirage, so the Fata Morgana, plays a very important role because it connects the kind of climate moment with the question of the human imagination. There is the dimension of mobility, imagination, and even fiction, part of the very conceptualization of the mountain as environment. The house as reference dissolves, tries to negate itself, vanishes. So finally, with having in mind this question of the Fata Morgana and the Mirage, we can discuss whether this might be seen as a utopian vision of a new relationship towards the environment, this kind of pure imagination, or a dystopian commentary that we are lost in mediated, artificial, multiplied postcards, unable to start a new exploration. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Ahora tenemos un espacio para preguntas.
Fascinating. I didn't know that work, and it kept resonating with the image that I showed yesterday, obviously because of the cabin and the cottage. And one of the questions that came up yesterday was if these mountains that I was showing of Emson were the campesinos looking at them, or were the volcanoes looking back to them. And this last image really made me think of this idea where what is also happening is the idea that this nature is not existing if it's not placed on the surface. If nobody is looking, is nature existing at the same time? Right? The idea of the tree that falls in the woods, and if nobody hears it, did it even make any sound? So it resonates on this idea that what the artist is trying to do is also creating a surface for that natural environment to exist on that surface, right? So it's not an entity in itself. It needs to be reflected. It needs to appear on another surface for it to exist.
But the funny thing is, of course, that at the same time, in the Swiss context, there was a discussion whether this would be the kind of solution of the new touristic buildings, that they wouldn't disturb the landscape, right? So this kind of negation of itself, that the construction itself as a trace is dissolving and only rest as an imagination, not only the imagination of nature, but also the question of how we envision the house, or how do we think about the framing, and this dream of having an experience that is not framed and would be liberated from these interfaces.
And then the interfaces, which we would, the traditional window here, are left, they're empty.
Exactly.
Well, I think Jens first.
Thank you, Peter, very much. It's rather a comment, but it goes also back what Gerhard had said about the ideology critique. When you showed the picture of the museum to look to the city, and I bring this together with the panorama of the Alps. For me, it came into my mind, and I think it's the first really huge picture that framed the panorama is Hitler's Obersalzberg, where he invited all the guests to see the huge, the wonderful German landscape. And Martin Bormann was asked to destroy the hut. They lived there because there were some small huts from the people who were this German landscape.
Yes.
And this, in the visual culture, it reappears in this last second Grindelwald. So in this, it reappears in public culture, popular culture, in the last movie. So this is like ecological, the opposite of some critique, but it's also the nature. And this kind of fascist and Nazism, how they treat also nature as something pure. And this is also an outcome what we have discussed, what is a possibility to discuss Humboldt in that way.
Oh, absolutely. I like this idea of that they. I mean, even you could discuss this building as, the kind of that you. What I meant with kind of that you try different roles. It's very interesting, really, to observe how people try to make use of this house, and try different gazes. No, absolutely. I mean, the device against the birds would be.
Thanks for your talk. I was really struck in your description of the kind of cultivated artificiality of the environment in the Alps, which got me thinking about the Coachella Valley as not only a popular tourist destination, but the site of a major music festival, which has a, let's just say, spectacular quality when it happens every spring. And then Detroit also is a place where people now flock to see the ruination of the city and the fact that this isn't a bank that's now in disuse. So it got me thinking not only about translocationality, but I'm wondering if you could also speak to transmediality. And I'm thinking in particular about the way that I really like the way that you're describing the mirage as both a kind of presence and absence, that it's reflecting and disappearing, but the way that that as a kind of architectural, sculptural form is also enacting a kind of image making that's still, if you're still, and moving, if you're moving, which also involves a kind of performative element to it as well. So the work seems to be bringing together at least 5, say, types of media enactment common to contemporary art, but at the same time, much like it is a mirage, occluding their presence.
Yeah, you framed it beautifully. I mean, yes, absolutely. And I think, I mean, you might know, we could discuss now several other examples where actually artists use a kind of, how you call it, kind of feeding the media image then back into their own work, right? And there, the studio doesn't comment on it at all. But when you look at the renderings, I mean, the first image I showed to you, it's very interesting because it's highly manipulative, right? I mean, the snowy image. So I think they should, and probably he will, produce actually maybe a video or something. Oh, sorry. Where is it? Here. This is a rendering. And you see, it's people come because they see this image. And they want to, we heard discussions of, where is this mountain? Because it's really, it's an imagination. And then it's interesting how people use their devices to manipulate as well, to recreate this image. So we discussed it, that I think this question of reenacting actually is one of the really fascinating modes of dealing with these several kind of translations and being part of these translations.
Thanks for a fascinating presentation, which I think provokes all sorts of interesting considerations about Humboldt and architecture, as did Professor Garcia's presentation earlier. I can't help thinking of, the founding metaphor of ecology, rooted in the Greek term oikos.
Oikos, yes,
home.
Exactly, yes.
And to what extent is Aitken reflecting, so to speak, on Humboldtian efforts to construct the Earth as a home, a planet that we now in the Anthropocene are rebuilding as a built environment. The planet is no longer merely natural, it is now a construction. And it also, this and Professor Garcia's comments raise interesting questions, it seems to me, about whether ecology is about simply comprehending a closed system or revealing the openness and the impossibility of closure, which seems to be something that Humboldt grappled with in Cosmos. This sort of cosmic enclosure idea has an ancient history in architecture. I think of the Pantheon in Rome and Boulet's design for the funerary monument to Newton. This problem of closure versus openness and ecology's elusive attempts to comprehend it are very much an issue here. That's just
I mean, the uneasiness for me starts, that this installation invites such a kind of poetic description of house and ecology and so on. So sometimes I'm feeling uneasy about its how could one say? It's so generic for a certain discourse. I'm looking for the kind of resistance. And what I actually then loved is that they got rid of the birds, but they didn't got rid of the kids who realized that they can, with snowballs, create new images of nature by just, I mean, it's a stage set, and as such, it lacks a certain, I have to say, I have the same problems with ELIAS sometimes, yeah.
Before we hear,
I have
George,
one more question.
Excuse me. Before we hear, just to point one thing out, you mentioned in your talk kitsch, and that it's close to kitsch, but actually you avoided to define the limits between kitsch and art. In the case of Dan Graham, and what you said is already a definition of kitsch, of virtual kitsch. So
yes, it's a very personal remark. I mean, it's somebody said to ELIAS it's an IKEA artist. It's so easy to consume, right? It's really such an open structure. You can say it's an ideal piece for being inclusive, right? So everybody loves it. It's a very inclusive statement.
So one more question as to this image, which shocked me in a way, because it's not existing. This is not the right place, I mean, it's a fake news. So did you make that image, or did you take it from somewhere?
It's a studio.
See, this is really something very political, because this landscape is known by me by each square meter. And the first image I say it's impossible. This building cannot be in front of Jungfrau Mountain. It's impossible. So it's actually a fake. It doesn't exist. It's not there.
It's a mirage.
It's a mirage. Yeah. It's okay. So, but then they sort of like transport this with the medias as if this building would be standing there in front of the Jungfrau region.
Yes.
So.
Okay.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Peter. Y ahora Peter Schneemann va a cambiar el rol del ponente a moderador.
So, we are coming to the last section, and it's a kind of Swiss section, as you might have realized. So, I'm very happy to welcome you to two papers by two PhD candidates from the University in Basel, having two different supervisors, Andreas Bayer and Ralf Ubel, but both present part of their PhD project. So I'm happy to give you the word to ELIAS Wagner, University of Basel, Schweiz, Albert Bierstadt, and the Swiss Alps. So we stay in the topic.
Yes, thank you. Before I begin, let me say a very big thank you to everybody who made this wonderful event possible, especially to Peter KRIEGER for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak in front of this wonderful and incredible group. I'm very thankful. And also a apologies for having to do this in English. Can everybody hear me with this microphone? Good. Do I use this? Could you turn off the... Thanks. Okay. Perfect. Today I want to talk about a painting that is probably familiar to most of you. Albert Bierstadt finished Storm in the Rocky Mountains, Mount Rosalie, in 1866 in his New York studio after sketches he had made in Colorado territory. Much has already been said about it, especially in terms of its ideology, relating it to frontier mythologies, manifest destiny, and American exceptionalism. What I will focus on today are two things. First, its visual properties, especially its compositional structure, which I think is necessary to really understand its politics too. Secondly, I will share some ideas about how and why the painting emulated Swiss landscape art. To understand the visual language of this painting, I will focus on its spatial organization. It deploys the genre's traditional academic method of creating spatial depth. Upright obstacles that block our view are pulled in from the sides in an alternating manner, like wings on a theater stage, forcing the eye to move from side to side and leading it further into illusionistic space through the succession of horizontal planes between them. The relative size of these obstacles translates to visual weight, and the balancing of these weights against each other evokes tension and resolve, infusing the imaginary path through the image with a sense of rhythm and dynamics. Another result of this operation is spatial coherence, which depends on how plausible the stage elements are scaled. Bierstadt sticks to this scheme, but he splits it into two orders of magnitude. Within the lower or smaller order, the zigzag motion between the repoussoirs happens all over, allowing us to navigate the ground. Certain areas use these familiar conventions to generate semi-autonomous sections. Roughly isolating a part like this, for example, gives us a unit that conforms to the characteristic conventions of the New York School of Landscape Painting, complete with elevated viewing position, panoramic sweep, and even a Colean dead tree in the foreground, which is over here. The painting makes such self-contained units subject to a second, overarching compositional order, one that consists of a most direct conjunction of the nearest foreground with the most remote distance. So what I'm trying to say is that from the foreground over here to the peak in the distance over there is there is a conjunction between those two. It orchestrates a visual jump diagonally across all of the depicted space, overriding the winding path through the planes that is happening within the smaller order. These two orders, or two experiences of space, one unfolding successively, one occurring instantaneously, these two orders are not really opposing each other. They both share the same principle of landscape space, which I just mentioned. Depth is a plane between upright obstacles. It is therefore more accurate to say that one spatial order is contained within the other in a way that elevates and transcends it. Compartmentalized and fragmented space is reconciled by an overriding force that imbues the image with coherence and unity. This formal structure is what makes the painting receptive to interpretations that relate it to histories of ideas, two of which I want to mention briefly. Firstly, there is the concept of nature, as described by Alexander von Humboldt. To be sure, here Humboldt's thinking wears a disguise that is very different from what we saw yesterday, for example, with Church's Heart of the Ants. What I want to relate this painting to is the broad notion that Humboldt developed in the preface to Cosmos. Nature is, we learn there, one great whole. Most significantly, she is, I quote, a unity in multiplicity of phenomena, a harmony blending together all created things, however dissimilar in form and attributes, end of quote. Emphasizing the dissimilarity, the overarching compositional structure of Storm in the Rocky Mountains integrates opposite phenomena. There is, for example, Mount Rosalie itself, radiant with Olympic majesty and eternity, its age measured in millions of years. Then right next to it, we see the dynamic flight of an eagle, over here, which relates to an experience of time that is almost incompatibly short compared to the seeming eternity of the mountain. Both appear in the same register, and both are integrated into a simultaneous space. Secondly, there is the concept of political unity in the post-war United States. As Nancy Anderson and Linda Ferber have convincingly shown, Bierstadt had, at least for a time, connected to this painting his ambition to become the first landscape artist whose work would be enshrined in the US Capitol. Landscape, understood as a unity in multiplicity, would serve as more than a metaphor for how independent federal states could together give rise to a unified political superstructure, especially inside a building whose dome bears the motto "E pluribus unum," the one out of many. Assuming that this painting does indeed want to meld its individual parts into an overriding, coherent entity, which I think it does, one has to account for certain inconsistencies of its spatial structure. For example, the foreground establishes a vantage point which is lower than the upper lake right beneath the stormy clouds. So when we are situated somewhere here, we are definitely lower than this, what appears to be a lake, if you can discern it. The surface of this lake should therefore not be visible from this angle, but it clearly is. Secondly, if you roughly triangulate the height of the distant snow-capped peak, you arrive at an unrealistically high number. A contemporary critic took exception to this when he wrote in Watson's Weekly Art Journal, I quote, "What is the height of Mount Rosalie? Answer, approximately 10,000 miles or so. Impossible." End of quote. The parts do clearly not add up to a single homogeneous space conforming to the rules of linear perspective. Angela Miller observed exactly this in another, earlier painting by Frederick Church. There she read the inconsistencies very similar to this one, as a failure not only of the artist's abilities, but more importantly, as evidence for how the visual vocabulary of academic landscape painting was essentially incapable of creating the vision of unity to which it aspired. I suggest to flip her argument around. In Mount Rosalie, the focal point of the perspective moves further up the deeper we get into its space. So, to maybe explain, focal point of perspective when we are located here is, well, here it is lower than when we see this, and it is again lower when we see this, so that the part of the painting that we see always appears right at the level of our eyes. So the focal point moves up. This amounts to a central experience that I would like to describe as a falling upwards, borrowing a phrase that Joseph Hoffmann used for a Caspar David Friedrich painting, which applies the same effect. The natural and political unity that emerges from diverse parts therefore finds an aesthetic equivalent in the aspirational and anagogic structure of visual experience, but especially by virtue of the parts being heterogeneous and inconsistent, not in spite of it. I move on to my last part. Throughout the 19th century, writings on American landscape were riddled with comparisons to the so-called Old World. Especially and almost obsessively, it was measured against what was perceived as Europe's natural crown jewels, the Alps of Switzerland. But the Adirondacks, the Appalachians, or the Green Mountains of Vermont, they simply didn't stand a chance in this competition. So when Bierstadt traveled west and afterwards presented what were for many viewers the first images of Western scenery they had seen, he did so partly to finally provide the American imaginary with something that could stand up to this natural nemesis. We know that Bierstadt was very familiar with Alpine painting from Switzerland. Maybe most importantly, he knew the work of Alexandre Calam, who was at mid-century Switzerland's most acclaimed and successful landscape painter. The two of them probably also met in Switzerland. One of the things Bierstadt learned from painters like Kalam is a representation of peaks that emphasizes their height. Here you can see one of many examples. It is a visual idiom that revolves around the appearance of a distant peak hovering high above. Sometimes even above the clouds, which is getting us closer to Mount Rosalie, another example by Kalam. And here, with one of the most famous mountains of Switzerland, the appearing peak resembles Mount Rosalie even in shape. Moreover, the name of this peak, Jungfrau, which we had already also just seen on the rendering, Jungfrau, which means virgin, just like Mount Rosalie, reproduces the trope of the female mountain waiting to be conquered by the male gaze. Thanks to its composite structure, Bierstadt's painting is able to incorporate the rhetoric of the appearing peak like a visual quote, and it integrates it into a far larger, far more spectacular and diverse composition, in an attempt to surpass whatever came before. But my point is not that Bierstadt used the Alps just as an iconographic reference. Bierstadt and Kalam shared a sensibility, an attitude towards nature, which is connected to certain visual conventions. This attitude enabled them to charge the depiction of mountain scenery with a range of semantic values. I think that Humboldt feeds into this attitude. To be approximately the 10th person to show this, at least, we have not yet talked about how this illustration applies a global perspective. Right here, I think, it notes the height of Mont Blanc, the highest peak of the Alps. And also in one of those columns, there are other heights of other global, mountains all around the world. What Humboldt and Bierstadt have in common is the idea of global comparability, a concept that drives Bierstadt in his endeavor to surpass Switzerland by incorporating its visual tropes. One final comparison to show the shared attitude of Bierstadt and Kalam. This painting by Alexander Kalam shows a particular part of Switzerland's Lake Lucerne. It is a tourist favorite, not only because of its sublime beauty, but also because it is the site of the Rütli-Schwur, the mythic oath that established the first union of Swiss states back in the 13th century, allegedly. In the 1800s, this oath became an important part of Swiss national mythology. Kalam painted this in 1849, right after Switzerland fought a civil war, after which the modern Federation of Switzerland with a new constitution was formed. Kalam's painting is a vision of national unity, but interestingly, without any explicit mention of political contents or historical facts, for example, just like Storm in the Rocky Mountains. Just like Bierstadt, Kalam lets nature do all the heavy lifting. The mountain, bathed in majestic light, lends a sense of eternity and normativity to the political implications. To sum up, Storm in the Rocky Mountains demonstrates the fusion of discrete parts into a larger whole. It implicates a relatedness of national unity and natural unity, while the latter had won cultural ground partly through a certain reading of Humboldt. The sensibility that enabled this kind of imagery is not distinctly American, but a part of a modern attitude toward the world in general. Thank you for your attention.
Yes, thank you very much for this careful compositional analysis. The floor is open. Who would like to start? Yes, please. Microphone's coming.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much. I am struck by the fact that Humboldt knew Kalam's letters on landscape painting, and they corresponded back and forth between each other. It did not end up playing a huge role in what I was doing, but I think it's going to play a big role in what you're doing, partly because those letters were translated probably badly, and reproduced in the American periodical The Crayon, which was
Oh,
the
really?
first
Okay.
art publication, which means that Bierstadt would have had access to Kalam in English. Again, I'm not going to vouch for the translation from the original French or German, but it does strike me that there are some Humboldt scholars who believe that Kalam's aesthetic approach to landscape informed Humboldt. It seems to be a point of a little bit of contention, so I'm leaving it to them. But again, I suspect that that might be a fruitful avenue for you to tie all of this together to really sort of see how both Kalam and Humboldt are operating on an American artist of German extraction, painting something in the United States that looks like the Swiss Alps.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is definitely something I have to look into because I didn't know about it.
I just found out about it not that long ago. I don't think it's something that you would have necessarily come across without someone nudging you that direction. So don't feel.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Not a criticism at all.
The
It's
trip
really
was
more
already
about,
worth it.
This is exciting.
Yes. Yeah.
I'll also say that that was great. It's wonderful to have a painting that is so familiar, defamiliarized by way of that kind of unpacking. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about this notion of falling upwards, because I think you're absolutely right. But I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about how it works and what is mobile. So is it the viewer that is falling upwards? Is the landscape in motion in relation to a stationary viewer? Do these dynamics matter? And what do you imagine is the upshot? I mean, is the upshot that the viewer is set into motion such that the discordances and inconsistencies are evacuated? Or because it strikes me that you're saying more than what might be traditionally said, which is this is an invitational landscape. One is invited in to traverse its terrain. So can you say a little bit about where the motion is, who is moving, and to what it adds up?
Well, I have indeed thought about it as motion of the viewer. Something like an ideal motion. It's not a physical motion. But I think you're absolutely right that this is not the only thing that's moving here. When you stand in front of paintings of this size, and I haven't mentioned that this is huge. It's 3 meters by 2 meters or something. What is it again?
Yes, give it 210.
210 by 360. You naturally move your feet in front of a painting like this. And the whole process of familiarizing yourself with it while viewing it is a process of mutual movement. What I think happens is, I like this notion of falling upwards because it's something that you are not conscious of, at least not 100% while it is happening. It is something that is when you are in front of, paintings like these kind of, how do you say that? They challenge you in a way, how do you say, überfordern in English? Überforderung.
Oh.
But no, doesn't matter.
Challenging.
They put a certain stress on you, to say the least. And to be able to comprehend them as a whole is a matter of real artistic skill, I would say. Overwhelming, thanks, somebody said it. Yeah. Thanks. So what a painter like Bierstadt has to do to fill a canvas of this size is to use certain effects that you could also call tricks, maybe, that leave the viewer with a, I would say, impression of wholeness, of simultaneousness of impression, something like that. And the falling I like because it captures the kind of passiveness that the viewer experiences when he step by step moves through this painting. I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll just add. This isn't a question, and
Okay.
and I'll turn over the mic in just a second. But it also feels as if, I mean, there could be a flip side to it in which we imagine the landscape arraying itself and its parts moving for the viewer as that viewer moves in relation to it. So there's a kind of exchange rather than simply the landscape acting on the viewer or the viewer acting on the landscape, kind of a dance. Okay.
Yeah, I like that idea. Thank you.
I actually wonder, I mean, your careful kind of, really not only analysis, but really close reading, did you try to compare it to historic art criticism? Because these paintings were described, right? And I wonder whether you could give us some indications about the shifts you realized, the viewers in the 19th century, how they described the overwhelming effect and so on, and whether there are some elements you would say where you can reconstruct a certain historic perception, and there are certain points where you say this is very much now a 21st century reading I'm suggesting.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Interestingly, at least as far as I know, if you compare the contemporary reviews to Heart of the Andes, for example, the notion of overwhelming is not as virulent here as it is with Heart of the Andes. And I think that there are certain reasons for that, because this painting, compared to Heart of the Andes by Church, really, I mean, I could show some things. There are certain symmetries that you cannot really see now. Maybe that goes too far. But what most reviewers commented on is things like tropes, like the Americanness of the scene, the way in which the approaching thunderstorm sound is the sound of progress that will drive off the Native Americans who are pictured there. I'm not aware of a contemporary description that does exactly the same as I'm doing. That's true. I mean, people are pointing out all these inconsistencies. People are saying you shouldn't be able to see this lake, and the mountain is way too high, and somehow the parts don't really add up. But they don't describe it. That's people who are not in favor of this kind of landscape painting anyways. People who are trying to approach it with a more, let's say, open manner, don't really describe, as far as I know, this sense of overwhelming. I think it's not a problem for me. I think this.
Oh no, not. I was kind of suggesting almost the opposite, that you give your own reading a kind of political twist, or kind of kind of programmatic claim that is linked to your reading, that it is a contemporary reading of today. Any other questions? Yes, please. The microphone is coming.
It might be interesting to compare this painting to Bierstadt's Donner Lake image, which they view downward, to see if a sense of falling is somehow represented in ways that are similar to this composition. I have bits of it in mind, and it might be an interesting, useful point of comparison. It's also a manipulated image, as I recall as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, thank you very much. We're closing? Okay. Real quick, I didn't point out that when you are moving, at least visually moving, through what I call the smaller order of things in this painting, at first you also fall downwards. It goes down really steeply to land on this plane. And Bierstadt, I mean, this is by far not the most exaggerated painting by Bierstadt, paintings like Donner Lake, and afterwards some of them emphasize height in a way more over-the-top way. So this is rather mild compared to some other things he did.
Thanks. That's great.
Okay,
Great
so
presentation.
thank you very much again. And we are coming to the last art historical paper by Gilles Monet, also from the University of Basel, visualizing the Alpine landscape in the era of the Anthropocene.
So first of all, I would like to thank the UNAM, Peter KRIEGER, and the Terra Foundation for organizing this conference and for giving me the opportunity to present something. And I would also like to excuse me for my English because I know it's not very good. So I hope you will understand me. So today I would like to present a case study from my doctoral thesis, which investigates the representation of the balance of power between man and nature in the case of the Alpine landscape from the 18th century to the present day. I hope to highlight through this example how the heritage of Alexander von Humboldt's thinking is still alive when it comes to examining contemporary works of art. I think we will have a better example or contribution after. Since the 1990s, the Austrian photographer Louis Eschenbleichner has focused his artistic production on the representation of his native region, Tyrol. At the core of his artistic research lies the issue of mass tourism and its effects on the landscape and the environment. Eschenbleichner explored this topic through the production of several photographic series. In the series Mountain Exploit, so here an example. For example, the artist decided to reveal the behind-the-scenes of winter sports by photographing specific mountain sites during the summer season in order to show, once the snow has melted, the considerable traces that winter activities leave on the landscape. In my presentation today, I will focus on another series called Behind the Mountains. In realizing it, Eschenbleichner used pre-existent material, a stock of black and white photographs taken between 1936 and 1970 by Armin Nelly, an independent rural engineer on behalf of the Tyrolean Agricultural Society. Through his photographs, Nelly documented the Tyrolean rural society at a time when neither the industrialization of agriculture nor mass tourism had yet impacted the region. His images thematize a lost world where man lived in a supposed idealized harmony with mountains on which he entirely depended. Attracted by this material, Louis Eschenbleichner selected some of the 10,000 images of the collection and decided to pair them with photographs he took himself in the same region in present days. The series Behind the Mountains is also as a result of the coupling of pairs of ancient images with contemporary ones. Eschenbleichner are strategically created to reproduce or re-evoke the general composition and formal structures of Nelly's pictures. This research produced a sense of formal and visual continuity between the two images, evoking a sort of geolocated identity, sometimes not even without tragico-comic and ironic effects. If Eschenbleichner builds these diptychs in a way to create a sense of continuity between his own and Nelly's photographs, he also employs visual elements to mark a difference. The friction between Nelly's black and white pictures and Eschenbleichner's photo in color generates a visual and intellectual fracture through the diptych, suggesting that, despite the relatively short time gap, the society that Nelly documented belongs to a different world that has disappeared. The contrast is even increased by Eschenbleichner's choice to resort to blatant colors. In the remaining time, I would now like to deepen some thought on a particular case out of the series that thematizes the impact of human activities on the Alpine landscape and its violence more evidently than others. On the left, we can see an image taken by Nelly during the warmer season, showing the effects of an avalanche that fell during the winter. Many tree trunks are scattered on the ground, broken in disorder. At first glance, 2 cottages appear to have escaped the destruction, but a closer look reveals that they were hit along the facade facing the mountain. At the center of the image, here. So at the center of the image, a man observes the damages. In the economy of the picture, his reduced dimensions present him as a fragile creature in relation to nature and its violence. His presence in the mountain environment appears threatened. Through these elements, Neely's documentary image staged a process of naturalization of violence. On the right side, Asian Blackness photograph illustrates a mass of cars and buses accumulated into the countryside in occasion of an outdoor music concert performed in Karlsruhe in 2007 by Karlsruher Spatzen, an Austrian traditional band. The almost oval shape designed by the buses accentuates the feeling of the intrusion of these vehicles in the natural environment. Observed on its own, Asian Blackness photograph would mostly appear as the image of a massive intrusion of human presence into the green space of the mountain, not predisposed for similar events. Through the means of visual analogy, the juxtaposition between Neely's and Asian Blackness photograph lent to Asian Blackness' work a violent dimension that this could not necessarily express with the same intensity. Its message becomes evident: the destructive effects of human activities on the Alpine environment and the resulting consequences of the mountain landscape. Asian Blackness operation suggests that the massive intrusion of man into the mountain landscape has the destructive consequences of an avalanche, the most ferocious natural phenomenon for man in the mountain environment. Behind the mountains indeed suggests that the Alpine landscape is not immutable. On a formal level, the buses in Asian Blackness' work occupies the same place as the trees in Neely's picture. This parallelism pictures the buses as agents of destruction, the same role that the snow now melted in the first image. From a technical point of view, while Neely's photograph shows the resulting effect of destruction, Asian Blackness' picture displays the destructive process taking place in front of the beholder. The fields where the car and buses are located will appear in a similar state to that of the landscape after the passage of an avalanche. To conclude, Behind the Mountains shows the transition from a nature scarcely affected by a traditional agricultural society to a nature exploited for leisure in a mountain region where this shift happened only recently, which is the reason why in the series it appears even more acutely. In other Alpine regions, this kind of transition already started during the 1840s, 1850s, and had a slower and more gradual course. This long-lasting and less visible transition tends to induce the contemporary observer to forget how strong the effect of human activities on the Alpine environment can be. By letting the images speak for themselves, Asian Blackness seems instead to point out how the Alps in the last decades became more and more a place of entertainment par excellence, as British writer Leslie Stephen already suggests in his book The Playground of Europe in 1871. By linking a supposed loss of harmony between man and nature with a process of destruction of nature itself, Asian Blackness' work stands in the direct lineage of Humboldt's denunciation of the impact of human activities on the environment and climate change. However, unlike Humboldt, Asian Blackness returned only to the image as a medium to reflect on ecological challenges. Images have a different power of communication in respect to words and numbers, which sometimes can be more direct on a large scale. I think that one interesting aspect that emerged through Behind the Mountains is precisely the importance to acknowledge the specificity and unicity of art and images as a thinking medium to understand the changes of the environment in the area of the Anthropocene. The possibility to visualize these challenges allow us to know and experience them in a different way, opening new horizons for the future development of geoecology. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Maybe I'm tempted to directly to her because I have a strong question. I was struck by I was really kind of wondering whether you looked at the way this kind of coupling images as a kind of visual strategy has in recent years become the major, how should one say, strategy in magazines to raise this awareness. You have the kind of chronological pairing, so 100 years ago and today with the glaciers is always this visual strategy. And then, as you said, you have this visual typology that we know, for example, from Magnum in the 50s to explain contemporary art. So having a Pollock and then a natural disaster next to it. So these kind of, I wonder whether you could develop something on this almost fashion of visual analogy as politics.
Yeah, I think, as you said,
and black and white and color and.
Yeah. So as you said, I think it's quite common to do it, but I don't want to minimize the work of some people. But I think usually it's just, so to say, before and after. So, for example, the state of the glacier in I don't know when and today to show how much it's mattered in 10 years, 100 years, and so on. But I would say just the same location, the same landscape. Oops, sorry. So it's just a documentary comparison, I think. And here I think it's very interesting, or if I go back here, I think it's more interesting because we can really feel that Asian Wagner try to put or to give a continuity between these two images, because I didn't maybe say enough, but it's on the same place. It means on the same region in general.
Yeah,
It's not on the same place.
Yes.
I think we can see it.
Yes.
Very, very.
But even there, I would claim. I mean, I'm missing now examples, but we all know them. It's a very established strategy.
Yeah.
It was almost something funny about it, right? I mean, this snow machine and the farmer who distributes the
water.
Well, or something else for. It's not water.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry. Please. Yes. Could we have a microphone here? The microphone is already gone. Would you otherwise just come to the front? We have time enough.
Yeah, just picking up this point that Peter was alluding to a moment ago. I mean, I was struck by the humor of these, maybe even more so than humor, the kind of farcical quality of them.
Sorry, what
a kind of humor that's parodic, parody, sort of humor that makes fun.
Yeah.
And wondering if you could, if that's something that one has struck you, and perhaps to think about that as a kind of avenue of commentary for thinking about contemporary ecological politics, approaching it through the parodic or the farcical.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe it's not a good example what I choose, because as Asian Wagner is living and it's an artist, so it's quite hard to find his images, and I didn't want to take pictures of the book.
I think they're wonderful. But you know,
yes,
this question of fun, it's so evident, you know.
I think I think it's great. But what I mean is, maybe with this, maybe two last example, we have this feeling that it's ironic. But if you take the book in general, it's very. I think it's not the point. The point is the denunciation of masterism and its effects. So I would say this humoric, ironic dimension is a side part of his work, I would say, because once again, what he does, it's really about denunciation of masterism and his effect. But if you want, I have the book here. I can show you more precisely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just as a additional thought about it, I mean, it seems like, yes, it's not kind of on the surface of the work, but something that kind of bubbles up in it. Possibly something to think about.
And maybe we could approach it by looking at the ways he the dissemination of these images. You said he produced books as well, so artist books.
Yeah.
But he's also in the media, right?
Yeah, he is. So if you are, there's a lot of articles, newspaper speaking of him. But I have to say, maybe to answer your question again, his work doesn't. So many people are not happy with this work, and he was punished many times. So he couldn't show his images for even more this one. So this series, I mean.
Yes, over there, please, there, Rachel.
Thank you. I have a question also about the pairing, but I'm curious to know what is meant to happen to the first photograph in the pairing, because it sets up, exactly as Peter was saying, the before and after, but it also strangely valorizes the subject matter in the first photograph as if that was the better before.
Yeah.
And so there's this feel there seems to be, and maybe it's inadvertent, but there seems to be a kind of nostalgia generated. But of course, in each of the three photographs from an earlier era, we're looking at human intervention in the land. So I'm wondering if you can speak about the complexity of the juxtaposition and what's at stake in using the earlier photographs as the sort of, not sure, the good photograph versus the bad photograph.
But that's why I said, I think 2 times, I supposed harmony between man and nature, because of course, I think there is a parti pris, I don't know how to say it in English, but an idea of nearly to say it was better before, right? And maybe it was better before if we think about environment, climate change, and so on. But I'm not sure it was better on every level. I think maybe social level and so on. But what I think is really interesting about this comparison is that if you take the image on the left, you have an image and a story. If you take the picture on the right, you have an image and a story. But if you take the two together, then you have a third story. Mm-hmm. And maybe this third story is upon the observer to bird, to bird. And I think the power of this series is in this confrontation, in this third image and third story.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, it's not the same as the before and after structure then, because what you're saying is that it's dialectic, but the new photograph is meant to make us read the old photograph again. So it produces a counter narrative for the earlier photograph, which is slightly different from the binary of the sort of popular media before and after, right? Which is interesting.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other question? I think it would be really interesting, if I may, so going back into, like a magazine like Magnum and looking how this was used as a didactic tool. And even in school books, you find this. So I really wonder where this comes from. It's kind of try to find the mistake, or try to find what is connecting and what doesn't fit and what does fit. Because here, I mean, this is really great because he uses as well a big machine to pump actually, how you say, the cows, cow feed, right? And actually, this is part of the disaster we have now in the Alps because it's killing all the herbs, and we try to find regulations for the farmers that this is not allowed anymore. So it's definitely not water. So I find this very interesting, this idea of saying, first reading, it's kind of the innocence, and then the second reading, because here as well, I mean, it's the highest, it's a Zuchtbulle, how you say it. It's really the kind of it's a manipulation of the animal to become the status symbol for the farmer, right? And there are fairs and there are prices, and now it's the big machine. So you could read it as a commentary. It's nothing else. It's the same. It's really, really fascinating. Well, if there is no further question, we're a little bit ahead of time. We thank you very much again. And as you have realized, we are all, I think, thrilled that we have artists, several as well, participating here at this conference. I think it's really very, very important. And I'm happy that George Steinmann was ready to speak about his work as a kind of last intervention. You know, there's an ongoing dispute in art history. What is the best position to give an artist in a conference? And when some of you might remember this polemic by Joseph Kossuth saying, you know, the art historians like to comment on my work as a kind of secondary digestion, and I don't want this. And at the same time, there is a counter-narrative giving the last work to the artist. You say, well, and now we come to the nice part and concluding.
Okay.
When we come to George Steinmann, I think it's very important to recognize that we have a voice that defines the artist's role in society as a role of engagement, participating in discourses, political events. He participated as a delegate at the Climate Summit. Something else one should mention, he's really working on an interdisciplinary level with a variety of artists. He himself is as well a musician. Well, anyway, George, I give you the voice, and we are looking forward to your...
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Peter, as well. So much for inviting me to Mexico. This is really unique, and thanks very much also to the people who are behind the curtain and doing everything, including the translations, really. It's a great honor for me to address you today and to share some of my artistic works, all embedded, however, within the context of the UN Agenda 2030. So to make clear, my presentation is not an academic lecture, but rather more a plea for a dialogue. To start with, however, I would like to give you some background information on my artistic equipment in general. To start with, I'm educated as a visual artist and as a musician. And according to the University of Bern, who has awarded me an honorary degree, I'm also a critic who takes stand for ethical questions and defines sustainability as an action principle for responsibility. So for me, an artwork has never been exclusively an aesthetic object. In principle, my work aims to deny pure formalistic perception. The visual expression is not limited to just the formal elements of the artwork. My works visualize images that conceptualize meaning. I see art as a genuine cognitive faculty operating on the plane of transdisciplinary networking. And I believe that everything is related. Nothing exists by itself. An awareness of the mutual dependency of things is important in the work processes. The focus is on connectedness, context, and the complex relationship between the whole and its parts. In the widest sense, it's on the relationship among various paradigms. In this light, all my works are basic research. Disciplinary boundaries are crossed. The allusion of my work to other disciplines, including science, philosophy, and indigenous people's knowledge, therefore, is essential. Last but not least, during my entire practice as an artist, and due to the fact that I grew up in the Swiss Alps, I was always attracted to mountain landscapes and their aesthetics. Since more than 50 years now, I make excursions in these territories, and I hope to do so also in the future. So, first I will present you some indicator images and keynotes concerning the potential of art. This is kind of a contemplation without any text, without any words. So there were some few words missing in the basic lines, but I hope you got the message. So now, as to my working methods, I give you like 3 chapters or 3 examples. And the basic first information is this drawing on the left side. It's sort of like a mind maps calling the symbiosis of responsibility and really indicating that it's about the dialogue and the intersections of art, science, and knowledge of indigenous people. And this is sort of like the basics of all my works, all my installation working processes. Some of them last for 10 years or even longer. So the first chapter is about water and mineral water. Switzerland is considered to be the water castle of Europe. And since more than 30 years now, I research on the phenomenon of 16 highly mineralized water sources in eastern Switzerland, known since centuries for their curing qualities. Today, within the globalized water economy, there are no longer any commercial of significance, but even more of ecological importance. Every of these sources not only has different minerals, but also a different color. I've now, meanwhile, made hundreds of artworks in different scales and techniques with the essence of these sources. This is a source called Bonifatius. So I give you one example. Or this is sort of my laboratory in my studio with all the essences and all the geological pigments and so on, which I then further on use in my processes. One of my works is entitled Art Without Object, but with Impact, and was created in a participative process for the new headquarters of the biggest wastewater purification plant in Switzerland. A building constructed with the highest possible ecological standards. The project started 2008 in the first possible stage of the process, which is to say that the first architectural design sketches. A procedure which is, in contrast to most public art projects, absolutely exceptional. In the work process, developed in close cooperation with the architects, scientists, and the craftsmen on the construction site, I added mineral water from 3 curative springs to all water-based materials such as concrete, paint, facade plaster, or joint cement, etc. both in the interior and in the exterior, used for the construction of the entire building. So the final work, which you see here, the whole building, however, is entirely invisible. It is pure energy within the structure of the building, transcending the pure formalistic aesthetic foundation of an artwork and aiming to create a resonating space. The new building of ARA Bern is art, architecture, and the body of resonance at the same time. Art is in the building. An artistic intervention aiming to be both ethically responsible and valid as a work of sustainable art. As you know, the vision of sustainable development is one of the greatest challenges of our time. But this refers not only to scientific, economic, or sociological challenges. It also includes cultural aesthetic dimensions. Sustainable development in this particular context means being able to integrate art. In fact, sustainable development is an aesthetic imperative. I believe that it is time to discuss in a very serious way what role the arts can play in defining our sustainable future. The next chapter is about forests. I work in forests since about 35 years in the Northern Hemisphere, from Siberia to Northern Ontario. This whole process is always entitled with has a title in the midst, on the margins. And it's really much about forests and biodiversity. Forests has always been a major importance in my artistic work. They are wonderfully complex, multi-phased phenomena, a constantly changing organism with different structural configurations, not to speak of the beauty, the sounds, the sense, and the various facets of light. The contemporary forest interests me as a social mirror, a place where you can see all the fear, the ideals and conceptual tensions of the unfortunate dualism of nature here and culture there. This is especially relevant for alpine forests, which are indicators of climate change. Speaking about biodiversity, in all my works I use plant saps, or I collect berries, mushrooms, lichens, and so on. And blueberries especially, which you can see here, are omnipresent in all my works. But not for purely aesthetic reasons, but surveys the plants in question for its therapeutic significance. The blueberry is source material. This primarily concerns the essence myrtillin contained in the plant sap, and therein lies the deep symbolism in relation to the quinta essentia. For centuries, the blueberry has been a popular medicinal plant, among others, an eye therapeutic agent. This wonderful blue-violet color in myrtillin helps to improve the eyesight. I use this aspect in my artistic practice, for example, in photographs fixed with choices of blueberries, or as a dye for my mind maps, by now an oeuvre of many hundreds of works. So to give you just a few examples, this is an analog photograph taken in a forest in eastern Switzerland, very wild indeed, heavily to be assessed. And during the development process, I include the sap of blueberries. So therefore, all these photographs are having this blue dye, very special kind of atmosphere creating. And every photograph through that becomes a unique work. There's another example from a forest in Switzerland. And very often, especially also for this place, the berries are exactly collected in the same forest as the image comes from. This is a little example from one of these hundreds of mind maps which I made through my research work in conferences like the ones today and yesterday. And afterwards, I worked them over with pure blueberry sap. And so there are sort of mind maps, indicators for many different layers of thinking and perception as it comes to environmental issues, political issues, philosophical issues, etc. The third chapter is about glaciers and climate change in the Alps. Since the Rio de Janeiro Conference on Sustainable Development in 1992, I am interested in long-term observations and dynamics of the mountain climate systems and how they react on our anthropogenic disturbance and exploitation. Climate change, as we all know, is a fact of contemporary society. This is especially relevant for Switzerland and the Alps with increasing natural hazards and many more changes with consequences for tourism and etc. The consequences for the ecosystems are only visible in the vegetation, in the aquatic systems, in geology, etc. We observe a dramatic visual change in the mountain landscape. The Alps become great again. And this certainly doesn't fit to the romantic images needed by the tourist industry, for instance. Melting glaciers in the Alps, however, are not simply a matter of scientific facts and figures and political debates. Challenges arising from climate change and political responses must be assessed also from an artistic, aesthetic, emotional, and ethic perspective. So one of my first works on glaciers and climate change was made for an exhibition in 2002 entitled Dryness. And what we hear right now is the sounds from the glaciers, which I used for a 36-channel composition, Surround, which was then included in the exhibition. I'll just give you an impression of a few minutes. So I continue now the presentation. The place where that was recorded and where you saw the first photograph was a place called Steinglacier in the Swiss Alps. And here you see exactly the same place where the white chair is in 2016. And you can see now how much the glacier melted within this time. It's tremendous, not only in the length, but also in the volume. Another work I would like to talk about is entitled Symbiosis of Responsibility, which originally was initiated in the context with the mandate I had by the Swiss government as an artistic observer at the UN Climate Change Conference COP21 in Paris. I made quite a lot of research on glaciers in that year, 2015. I was for weeks moving around and watching and observing, and it's really about seeing, looking again, and really see what is changing even within 1 week or within 1 month. And this then was the basic for making a video film. I recorded a live concert on the Rhone Glacier, which then was a part of my work I did at the climate conference in Paris. And this is not a fake, there is no overdub, nothing like it. I really just performed live on the glacier, and it was filmed and it was recorded, and we had the option, of course, to make a post-production in the studio and make this or that kind of changes or so, and I just insisted, I don't do this, I play live, and that's the way it will be, with all the surrounding sounds as well, the ambience. So that's the video where it was the first time presented at the climate conference at the Grand Palais in Paris. And you see maybe one important observation in this video. The person, compared to MTV television, is not sitting in the center. It's the glacier which is in the center, and the artist is sitting on the side. So this is a really symbolic statement. So the complexity of climate change requires equally complex responses that entail the cooperation of stakeholders across the various levels and sectors of global community. Here, art can play an important role because, especially in climate science, there's an urgent need for communication, because many of the scales, many of the analyses are so complex. If you look, for instance, at the IPCC reports, altogether 6,500 pages. It's so complex, really. It's hard to communicate this to society and really to make the fierce urgency of this, to let them know. So I think, emotions and the visual things can play a very, very important role. Because with this ever-growing impact of science on our lives, art has an important role to play, reminding us of our humanity, of our emotions, and also of empathy. The quote here by the IPCC Symbiosis report for 2014, I think, is the keynote for the 2 days and even probably also for tomorrow for this conference here. Because the UN and the IPCC particularly put a focus on that we have to cross the borders. We really have now to cooperate at all scales, no matter what profession, no matter of what background, no matter of what talent. And of course, I include the knowledge of art. It should be included very much so. So this is sort of like a statement to my final words. We live, as we have heard, in the Anthropocene epoch, but I have a rather critical attitude to this. I think we are, from the geological term, rather more living in the Megalium time. But be it climate change, the loss of biodiversity, depletion of resources, economic inequalities, or the risks of transhumanism, the global challenges reveal the true extent of the interdependency of economic, social, ecological, and cultural processes. Due to the enormous complexity of our time, we are confronted with a new picture of the world, not only from a scientific, social, or economic point of view, but also from an aesthetic point of view. All phenomena therein are the expression of one and the same crisis, which is primarily a crisis of perception. Perception, in the broadest sense, is the core competence of artistic creation. In it, the research for transformations manifests itself. Demand for transformative problem-solving approaches, however, means nothing less but the program of profound revision of our social values. But this in turn requires confidence in the capacity for human development. The UN 2030 Agenda, a blueprint for the future of the world, is at the center of the transformation process. What does that mean for art? The implementation of the 2030 Agenda is a cultural task, a social process that creatively connects our present with the future. Therefore, the integration of the creative skills of the arts into these discussions processes is indispensable. A deliberation of the relationship between art, science, politics, and economics is long overdue, because an eco-social transformation of our society will not succeed so long as aesthetic tragedies are dispensed with. The question is, by which vocabulary can this be achieved? And what is the role of art in our time? What makes the scale of the ecological challenges facing the world today, as we have removed ourselves from the essential means to sustain life and destroy ourselves spiritually, emotionally, and economically? I see three essential features at the center. First, the principle of dialogue. Dialogue is the only appropriate alternative to segregation, fragmentation, and inflexibility. In fact, dialogue is the essence of the 21st century. This principle is more important than ever, not least of all because social reality has become far too complex for us to indulge in the luxury of reduction to discrete individual disciplines. Sustainable solutions will only emerge through the networking of different competences. I therefore believe that politics, public authorities, and the scientific institutions should involve us artists in the debate on sustainable society, as researchers, as advisors, ambassadors, board members, or lateral thinkers. And not too late, because that is very often the case. Artists are always asked too late. Second, the potential of a culture of respect. In times of disorientation, it needs an aesthetic of mindfulness. We live in an increasingly digitized world, we all know that, we are part of it, are totally linked up, have access to infinite amount of information. But all this will count for nothing unless we establish a culture of mutual respect at the same time. Only understanding of different views and perspectives will enable us to solve the pending problems. Ethical criteria, especially aspects of environmental ethics, are of particular importance. 3, the power of solidarity. What we need now are symbiotic systems. In nature, symbioses are highly effective systems of interdependence with existential impact. Lichens, for instance, indicate that the evolution of nature is not only shaped by competition, but also by social behavior. This is highly relevant. Instead of competition, the usual approach, we also have the option of mindfulness. Unrestrained expansion, turf war, or the usual narcissism of meaningless, because those who constantly think about how to outsmart the other one with ingenious strategies lose their ability to emphasize. Solidarity means trust in the we. Therefore, I plead for an ethos that will jointly shape the future. How will this be succeeded in practice? The following approach at least seems plausible to me. The time for pessimism is over. For this to succeed, we need a symbiosis of responsibility. Nevertheless, we're still far from living it because our actions are not based on what we know. On the one hand, there is still a lack of personal and political will to make a truly fundamental paradigm shift. On the other hand, there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the term sustainability itself, because sustainable development entails not only factual knowledge in the fields of economics, social issues, or ecology, but also the dimension of culture. All components are mutually dependent. Nothing exists by itself. But this approach is still largely unknown and plays only a marginal role even in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the Agenda 2030 agenda. Just to give you a point, within the SDGs, the word culture is mentioned once, and only in context to describe the word Mother Earth. So all what we do, in a way, does not exist, as it seems, with the policy and decision makers when they make such an important paper like the Agenda 2030. But I'm certain that a lastingly viable society cannot be achieved without the knowledge inherent in and imparted by art in all its aesthetic and cultural dimensions. But first and foremost, a sustainable society can only be realized if the separation between culture here and nature there is overcome. Ultimately, it is about the awareness of protecting our common home. This is a quote by Francis from Assisi. And opposing the cynical sanity of our time from a point of commonality. We are asked to resolve conflicts in a spirit of reconciliation. Doing so involves a sense of compassion and caring. We have to reconcile ourselves with our Mother Earth, and the answer lies within ourselves. So my last word, my last sentence is A, let's walk the talk. And B, let's walk the talk across the borderline. Thank you so much.
Thank you, George, for sharing your, I would say, manifesto. It has really a dimension of a manifesto. But I think we still have some minutes to start this dialogue. Peter KRIEGER, please.
Yes, thank you, George. I liked your expression of symbiosis of responsibility.
Thank you.
Where everything's coming together and generates a power. However, what we face is also a symbiosis of irresponsibility. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit on the political opposition, the counter powers of your ethical environmental position. And what's precisely the function of art, or the power of art, the potential of art, in against this, what I call symbiosis of irresponsibility. For example, in the US government, on the Brazilian government right now, these are the most obvious expressions, but it's a whole symbiosis of ignorance of environmental issues, or of this mental habit, not in my backyard, that I'm against climate change, but I don't change my daily destructive routines for using cars or plastics and so on. So could you a little bit talk about this? And I remember, I think you said that when you were in charge of this Paris conference, you even had oppositions from the Swiss government.
Yeah, I can pick this up.
Maybe you can talk about
that fits together.
The scheme. Where do you stand? How do you generate provocations? And how do you face the symbiosis of irresponsibility?
Okay, yes, very, very interesting point indeed. First, as just has been mentioned, I'm participating sort of like undercover agent in this kind of conferences which are usually presented by politicians, diplomats, policy makers, stakeholders from big companies like McDonald's or whatever, you know. So being part of that, and also that mostly the people do not know who I am because they think, okay, he's a delegate from a government or he's a delegate from an NGO or something like that, you know. So that gives me this very open view. I can have and develop this very critical view within the conferences. So talking about Paris COP21 or even the COP23 in Bonn, which was very strange because I had this accreditation from the UN, which also made it possible for me to have access to this so-called high panel segment discussions with all the ministers and even Frau Merkel and Macron and people like that, you know. And listening to that, it's really shocking to realize what is the ignorance against culture? What is the ignorance against indigenous people's knowledge? I can come back on this, you know, and of course not to speak about artists. They just don't consider that as being an important part to contribute for this incredible fierce urgency of we have in, let's say, like climate change, or the same thing about biodiversity or agricultural problems, water, whatever, you name it, you know, all the 17 points of the SDGs. So by using this, I'm trying to make critical comments, but of course with consequences. The consequences is that the established political system don't want to have an artist in such a conference because he has a maybe too critical view. He might observe things which are not so very clear and maybe so much with hidden agendas and stuff like that, you know. And I do that. And the example was very interesting in Paris indeed, because I had an official mandate from the Swiss Foreign Ministry. And my host in Paris was the Swiss ambassador. But the Ministry for Environmental in Switzerland opposed it entirely. They didn't want to have an artist in the delegation because they argued an artist has nothing to declare, nor does he have to say anything about the complexity of climate issues. And of course, still participated. Also, this is a paradigm which is very strongly appearing all the time, is almost daily practiced when I am in these conferences. But just because of that, I do it, because I really think, as what you say, the irresponsibility, we have to let them know that we observe their irresponsibility. They have to know that there are certain networks, certain people who really look very closely at what is going on, you know. And this is what I said, you know, on the Agenda 2030. Switzerland, for instance, has assigned this paper in Paris, and then later on they also signed it in New York at the end, you know, and then they formalize own papers, strategy papers for the strategy of Switzerland in the year 2030, and then it goes down to like the city of Bern, and they also make a paper, and in every paper, culture does not exist. So,
George, we have two other questions.
Anyways, all right.
Please.
I'll try to make it quick. I really appreciate those comments as a faculty member at an institution where environmental studies are dominated by policymakers and scientists, and where I'm working with a small group of environmental humanists to expand that program and make it include art and literature and other disciplines. Anyway, quick comment about one of your works of art. I loved the sound piece with melting glacial ice. And I have a question about the technique. Am I mistaken in recognizing the sound as a combination of sampled recorded bits that you arranged?
Yes.
Because I sensed a kind of abstract melody unfold. If that's the case, there's an interesting echo there of Bierstadt's recombinant approach to visual material. And it reminds us that we shouldn't expect art merely to reproduce nature, but provide us a kind of distillation, a critical distillation. Maybe in Bierstadt's case, he's open to charges of falsification, but in other cases like yours, you're actually creating a distillation that provokes us to think critically.
Well, thank you so much for these words. Of course, fantastic. Yes. So it's really based on field work. You know, I mean, you have seen the image from the technicians who were with me to record it with so-called hydrophones. They are very, very highly sensitive microphones. You can sort of like drop into the waters, or you can put it into a glacier or some very sensitive microphones. So we collected all sorts of sounds in all the different areas and glaciers and melting waters and so on. And then with the raw material, I went to the studio and we made this 36 channels surround installation, which, however, was part of a big multidisciplinary installation in a museum in Switzerland.
Okay. Jens Baumgarten.
I try to be very short. Thank you so much, and I agree with you 100%. And we talked during this colloquium, so I agree completely about all the topics you said. But I want to be now a little bit the bad guy to make the advocate of the devil. And because here's a big elephant in the room, we haven't named it. Because I remember a very interesting, it's a very short essay from Schumpeter from 45. So he was writing about the two main economic. So I'm speaking just 1 minute on economic because this is the big elephant in the room. So he said, so when you look for a socialist economic and a capitalist one. So the capitalist is more successful. It will be more successful. But the problem of the capitalist is it will swallow itself. So he said this in 45. It will destroy its own resources. So it will die because it will destroy exactly the environment and the human beings. So exactly, it is this exploitation, and he said this in 45. And I think exactly why do these other persons at the UN have so much problems? Because they don't, a sustainable society have to give up what is the affirmation of a capitalist or post-capitalist society to have profit. So if you give up to have profit, so all governments in Europe, in the States, are working with a capitalist system. So how can you deal with a sustainable society not giving up profit? I don't see that. Actually, there is reason, it was a publication in 2 weeks ago, that the most progressive economist said, I think we should rethink economic theory because we realize that microeconomics and neoliberal thinking are really destroying the basics of our society. So they start really to think, but perhaps they are fast enough before the destruction of this earth. We would be really happy about that. But you know what I want to say? Before, we can be very, we work together, and I agree with you. But how can we have a dialogue with in the power situation where they don't want to have dialogue? Because exactly they see environment and indigenous knowledge only as long as interesting as it brings profit.
Yes, of course, I do totally agree to what you say. Yeah, and that's what you say is the big elephant when I understood it the right way, But anyways, still, that's what I say. There's no time left for pessimism. Therefore, I really think we all have the potential to let them know, hey, we know, we observe, we have to change. And who is interesting, I mentioned this in one word, is indigenous people's knowledge, I was attending a conference, the Arctic Summit in mid of June, which was in the University of Rovaniemi, and there were a lot of NGOs and people from Inuit and First Nation people and Nentse and Sami and so. And I was very interested to see, first, their self-confidence, their self-consciousness raising up, very much so, but however, all their incredible despair. Mentioning once again Paris, in all these talks, seminars, panels, not one indigenous person was ever included, not one. Not from the Amazon, not from the Arctic, from nowhere. They had no access and they had no voice to tell them what is their concern and so on, and all their knowledge. And this is, of course, dramatic because the big elephant is investing a lot of money in the Arctic at the moment, very much so, about special minerals, especially about oil, gas, the passage across the northern poles and stuff like that. So it is a lot of going on, and therefore, I say, they have to be heard, and they really make statements. There was just this one thing 2 weeks ago in Switzerland. The Sami delegation from the Sami Council, these are the nomads in the Scandinavian area, also in Russia, they came with a delegation to Switzerland, to the Swiss bank CS, and protested because CS just financed a new copper mine in their very absolutely holy areas of their territories. And they came there with their total outfit and went to protest. So they're confident and they're really believing we can stop it and we can do that, and they support it.
Well, we realize that we will certainly continue this discussion. We have a last comment by Veronica, please.
Really quick, a comment and a question. So thank you, George, for this. I really want to go to Switzerland right now after these amazing photographs. My question and comment, first a comment and then a question, is about conservation in both in a conceptual, philosophical way and in a technical way, because I really enjoyed the blueberry photographs. And they got me thinking about the botanical expedition in New Granada when Mutis was working on these beautifully illustrated botanical illustrations. He figured out that he couldn't keep doing this project. First, if he was doing he was training the local artists in European watercolor technique. And second, if he didn't talk with the indigenous peoples. So he learned how to use a lot of he made pigments out of the same plants that he was actually representing, kind of a philosophical being of the entity, like the plant was built with its own pigment. And that's one of the reasons that they've been so well conserved at the botanical gardens in Madrid. And it was also kind of political. I've always thought that he was, at some point in his mind, he wasn't working for Imperial Spain anymore, and he was actually really fascinated with the indigenous relationship to the plants. So that was one comment to add that to the conservation, and that would mean if you feel how have these photographs behaved by being tinted by the blueberry. I was wondering about the conservation in the technical manner, and then if you've thought about this idea in a bigger picture.
Well, in the technical matter, the conservation is asked every day, every time, because I mean, how does it last? Does it change or so? From the technical point of view, there are possibilities to make it very stable for at least the next 2 or 3 generations, if you want to, because there, for instance, are museum glasses which are entirely absorbing UV lights, and so the conservation is actually quite good if you want to. But the question is, and that's the philosophical point, do you want to? It might be interesting that these works change within 2 decades, and then they may become brown, and maybe they become whatever, and but this is a philosophical question. But I'm very consciously working with that.
That's a wonderful conclusion.
Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. It was great.
Y están todos cordialmente invitados a la recepción con George Steinmann en el Centro de Arte Lagos a las 7.
Ja, danke.